This week, Italy goes to Washington, D.C. to meet Samuel Anthony Alito, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. In this interview, Justice Alito unveils everything about his Italian experience. Italian Leadership in America is a new series co-produced by iItaly and the National Italian American Foundation. Enjoy and stay tuned for more.
I'm John Viola, President of the National Italian American Foundation, and we're proud to partner with iItaly to bring you these inside looks at the Italian Americans of Washington, D.C. Today we'll sit down with Justice Samuel Alito and hear about his Italian American background and how it made him the man he is today. Take a look.
I learned that your parents were both brought here when they were rather young. So we would like to know where your grandparents came from in Italy.
Well, my father's family was from a little town outside of Reggio Calabria called Salina Ioniche. And my father was actually born there. My grandfather, his father, had come to the United States to work. And then my father came with my grandmother when he was about 6 months old. My mother's family is from a town called Palazzo San Gervasio in Basilicata, not too far from Potenza. And both families moved to Trenton, New Jersey. And I don't really know why they chose Trenton, but I imagine it was the typical story that someone from the town had been there, and they wrote back and they said, "This is a place where there are jobs, and a good place to move." So that's where they moved. My mother was born in the United States. She had 6 siblings, and the first 3 were born in Italy and came over with her parents. My mother was the youngest. My father was the oldest of the children in his family. His father was a man who had, I think, very little formal education, and he left home to work, I think elsewhere in Italy first, and then eventually came to the United States to work. And he was a laborer for the Pennsylvania Railroad, an unskilled laborer for the Pennsylvania Railroad. My mother's father worked in the Roebling steel mill in Trenton. Both families lived in an Italian neighborhood in Trenton called Chambersburg, and the Roebling steel mill was just a short distance, maybe a 10-minute walk from where my mother grew up. My grandfather worked there, and the Roebling steel mill was a famous place. It doesn't exist anymore, but that's where the cables for the Brooklyn Bridge were built, and the cables for the elevators in the Empire State Building. A lot of sort of iconic structures in New York City and elsewhere were built there.
I remember you once said that your father grew up in poverty.
He did grow up in poverty. He graduated from high school in 1932, and that was right in the middle of the Great Depression in the United States. So it was a time when the unemployment rate was very high. I think it had gone up to 25 or 30% during the worst years of the Depression. And his father, as I said, worked for the railroad, but he was out of work periodically during the Depression. So he was out of work a number of times. And that obviously was very hard on the family. There were not the social welfare programs at that time that exist at the present. And on top of that, my father's mother died when he was a teenager. She became ill very quickly and died. So the family was in a difficult position. My father was the oldest of the children, and he obviously spoke English. My grandfather never really spoke English very well. So my father had to take over at a kind of an early age as a teenager, a leading role in keeping the family going. And there were a number of occasions when they were evicted from their home, and my father came home from school and the furniture was out on the sidewalk. And so since he was the oldest child and spoke English, he had the responsibility of going around the neighborhood and trying to find a place for them to live. But he was a very good student. Despite these hardships, he graduated near the top of his class in high school. He had some friends who were also had similar grades, and they went off to leading universities, but my father and his family had no money whatsoever for him to go to college. So he initially took a job in a factory, and that's the course I guess his life would have taken, but he did get a very small scholarship. I think it was $50 from someone in the community, and toward the end of the summer. And that was enough for him to enroll in a local college, what was then called the Trenton State Normal School. It was a school to train teachers. It later became Trenton State College and then Trenton State University. Now it's called the College of New Jersey, and it's a substantial university. But at that time, it was a 3-year school to teach teachers, to get a teaching certificate. And so the $50 was enough for him to pay the tuition and buy a used suit and a used shirt and a tie, which he needed to go to class. And so that turned his life around. And I don't know who the person was who provided the $50 to him.
You don't know if he or she was an Italian American?
I don't know. In a way, I wish I did. But in a way, to me, it's sort of it is a story that shows the benefit that can come from what seems today to us to be kind of a relatively, an act of kindness. $50 in 1932 was more money, obviously, than it is today. But whoever did that really changed the course of my family's history.
Absolutely. And then after he graduated from college, he would have been a teacher, right? But then I think you said once that for Italian Americans, teaching jobs were not easy to get. How was that?
No, they weren't. He was, again, a very good student. He was one of the top students in his class in college, and he was the editor of the college newspaper. But it wasn't easy for him to be in college. I'll tell you one little story. He had a course that required the purchase of a little book. I think it was a book actually written by the professor, but anyway, you were supposed to purchase this book, and he didn't have the money to purchase the book while he was in college. So he went to the library, and he borrowed the book from the library, and then he copied the whole book by hand. So he had a copy of the book, but he had copied the whole thing by hand. The professor saw this in class, and the professor called him aside after class and said, look, if you don't have enough money to buy a little book like this, you really don't belong in college. Not very sympathetic, but in any event, he graduated and was, as I said, a top student, and his good friends from college were people who worked with him on the school newspaper. And they found teaching jobs. This was 1936, so this is still in the bad years of the Depression in the United States. He couldn't find any teaching job. So his first job out of college was as a state forest ranger. He went around inspecting the trees in state parks and forests in New Jersey. There was a disease at the time called the Dutch elm disease, which was killing off all the elm trees in the United States. So his job was to go around and find these diseased trees, and then they would cut them down to try to prevent this from spreading. As a result of that experience, he became very knowledgeable about trees. So when I was growing up, a typical thing for us to do on a Sunday afternoon would be to go to the park, and we would identify all the trees. And so at that time, I was very good at identifying trees. I could identify just about any tree that grew in New Jersey. Now I've forgotten. I've forgotten a lot, so at that time I could tell that's a white oak, a red oak, a different type of, I've forgotten some of it. So that was his first job. Then after that, I think he did that for a year or so. After that, he got a teaching job of sorts, but it wasn't a teaching job in a regular school. It was a teaching job in a boys' reformatory. That was probably less desirable, so a lot of teachers didn't want that job. So he did that for another year or two, and then he finally was able to get a teaching job in the Trenton public school system. My mother also was a teacher. They went to the same college, although they didn't really know each other at the time. And when she graduated the same year, she had also had some difficulty getting a job. She was first offered a job in one of the public schools in the area, and she said, "Okay, well that's fine, great, I'd love the job." And they said, "Well, now part of this job is that you have to teach Protestant Sunday school, even though this is a public school." And she said, "Well, I can't do that," and so she wasn't able to get that job. But she did get another teaching job. And she was very intelligent, very determined, very strong-willed person. She was the first person in her family to go to college. Her mother did not adjust that well to social relations in the United States. She had come from a small town, a rural town. She did not go outside of the house very much by herself. But my mother, as I said, was the first in her family to go to college, and she was very, as I said, very strong-willed. So she went to the same college as my father, and she was the first to get a car. She bought herself a car, and she drove. And then after she was teaching for a couple of years, she enrolled at Columbia Teachers College to get a master's degree. So she took the train from Trenton to New York, and I guess she took the subway up to Columbia to study for her classes. So that was very adventurous for somebody from her background.
So her parents had to adjust.
They had to adjust, yes. I think they put a value on education. Now, I would love to have heard the conversations involving her plans, but knowing my mother and how independent and determined she was, I can kind of imagine what she might have said.
Is it true that your father taught you how to write?
He did, yes. My mother was an elementary school teacher. She stopped teaching when I was born, and she did not go back to teaching until my sister, who is 2 years younger than me, went to junior high school. So throughout our elementary school years, she was home. So during all that period, she was not teaching outside the home, but she was still teaching. So we were her pupils, and what we did in school was just the beginning of the educational, her idea of what the educational process should be. So she had very high expectations of how we would do in school. It was just unspoken that we would get very good grades, and we would enter the science fair every year, and we would win the science fair every year. So she continued that through the elementary years, and then At some point, she kind of handed it off to my father, so he then became the supplemental teacher. But what he did mostly was to go over writing. He wrote beautifully. He was totally self-taught in English and in writing, but he was a beautiful writer. So if I had to write a paper, or my sister had to write a paper for school, we would write the paper and we would be satisfied. I thought I had done a good job. And then we would sit down at the kitchen table and he would go over it, every single word, every single sentence. Why did you use this? Why did you structure the sentence like this? What do you mean by this? Is this really necessary? What does it contribute? What about the organization? So it was, to start out, it was very painful, but I think that's how you have to learn writing.
Is it true that he once told you if you can't state something clearly, probably it's your thoughts, it's not clear?
Yes, he did, and I think that's valuable.
So your parents were very important for you?
They were, yes, very important.
What would you say is their moral legacy?
Well, they both were very hardworking, and they were very determined. They made a lot of sacrifices. They did not indulge themselves. They would do anything for my sister and me, and for the other members of our family. Both sides of the family was very close. So those are values that they instilled in my sister and me.
What about Italy, the motherland? Did they go back and visit? Did they bring you with them? Or?
They did not go back to visit until I was an adult. The first time they went back, and I went back with them, was when I was 25 years old. And we went to the places that first-time visitors to Italy tend to go to. We went to Rome and to Florence and to Venice, but we did not go back to the little towns where they had come from. They didn't have a lot of money and they didn't do a lot of traveling. Our vacations were, when I was growing up, were going to the beach in New Jersey. That was about it. So unfortunately, they never got back to the family, the towns where the family had come from. But my sister and I have done that since, yes. And it was, I found it a very moving experience, very, very interesting. My sister went back first to the town where my father's family came from. At that time, we still had some very elderly cousins who were living in the area. So when she went there, she found them, and they took her to this house, which was still standing, out in the country, made of stones. I think maybe, it looks like it's maybe 2 rooms, but it was still there. Beautiful, a beautiful setting, but olive trees, but very, very, very dry, very rocky. Then I went back and actually I made a trip with my whole family, with my wife and my 2 children, to both of the 2 towns within the last 10 years, and it was really moving for me, very interesting. By that time, when we went to my father's town, our cousins who were very old had died, so there were no relatives that we could find there. But we went to the parish church, and the pastor was very nice to us. So he took out the books of the registries of birth, and so we found my father's birth record and my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And we got back to just a little bit before Italian unification, and then he said that at that time there had been an earthquake. It's a part of Italy where they do have a lot of earthquakes, and the records were destroyed. So I think that's the dead end in trying trace my father's family's ancestry back beyond sort of the middle of the 19th century. And my mother's town was, and so Salina Ionike, near outside of Reggio, struck me for some of the things that I mentioned. It was very beautiful, and you look down and you can see the ocean, but very steep. It's up on a hill, comes out of the Mediterranean, very steep, very dry, very rocky. I don't know how they ever made it. In my family, we never knew exactly what my father's birthday was. There was a debate. He said that his birthday was February the 20th, but the papers that he had from the United States listed it as February 22nd. And this actually caused him some difficulty when he wanted to get a passport. He didn't have a birth certificate, and he didn't have anything to show exactly when he was born. But then after I was confirmed for the Supreme Court, the Italian embassy gave me a copy of the record of his birth from Salina Ionike, and it explained what had happened, because there was on this certificate, it said, the official who filled it out said that on the 22nd, someone who must have been a relative based on his name and another person had come to town to report that my father had been born 2 days earlier out in the country. So that's when they wrote it down. So that was the origin of the two dates. But it was nice to have that, and it also said on the certificate that the official had written this down because the people who had come to report this couldn't read or write. So that showed me something about the situation of my family at that time. And my mother's town was quite different, very far out in the country, and surrounded by what seemed to me to be very rich farmland, almost black. So we went there, and I do have some distant cousins who still live in that town. So we spent some time with them and looked around the town. It's a place where no tourist ever goes, and so when we walked around, everyone was looking at us. Who are these people who are walking around? We went to the church in town, which is located right. There's a hill, and then it's called Palazzo San Gervasio. The palazzo is a Norman, the remains of a Norman castle from, I think, maybe the 12th century. And then the church is on this hill right near the castle. So we went to a mass there. Doors were open during the mass, and there were dogs from town. They came in, they attended part of the mass, then they left. But a very pleasant, really very pleasant place. As we were driving up, as I said, it was very far out in the country. So we're driving along this road, and in the distance, we could see that there was something on the road. So what was it, right on the road? And as we approached, we could see it was a flock of sheep with someone who was tending the sheep right on the road. So this seemed like something out of the past. And then, as we got near it, I could see that the shepherd was a man who was obviously African. So it's kind of it shows how Italy has changed too.
What about Italian language? Did you speak Italian when you went there?
I did.
You were able to speak Italian?
Well, very basic. My parents did not speak Italian at home, and they didn't teach it to us, which is
your grandparents did.
A shame. My grandparents did, and my parents spoke to their parents in Italian. Although, yeah, I think at least with my father's family, it was definitely a dialect. I think my mother's family did speak standard Italian, because I have letters that were written by her brother from Europe in World War I. He was in France in World War I, and he was writing home to his mother. And I have those letters, and those are written, and he actually wrote very well, and they're written in standard Italian. But for some reason, whatever reason, my parents didn't teach us Italian at home. So I took some Italian courses when I was in college. And then the last 10 years or so, I've been trying to teach myself. So by the time, we've made quite a few trips to Italy in recent years, and I can, have very basic conversations.
So you would support the efforts of the Italian-American community and NIAF and the Italian government to strengthen the teaching of Italian?
Yes, absolutely. It's a beautiful language, and I think it's important for Italian-Americans to try to remember their heritage and remember their history, both in their history in the United States as immigrants to this country, but also the very rich cultural history that their ancestors experienced before they came here.
You went to Princeton and you went to Yale, top universities, and you once said something about the people, your colleagues, students, coming from privileged echelons of society, behaving irresponsibly. Can you recall those days and what was your impression and the impact that it made on you?
Well, one thing that I saw was that at that time, there was a feeling among a lot of college students, including my fellow students at Princeton, who came from much more privileged backgrounds than I did, that there was something wrong with their parents' values and with the kind of lives that their parents lived, that their parents had sold out, that they had become affluent by taking advantage of other people, and they had bad values. They were very materialistic. They were very status conscious, and I didn't feel that way at all about my parents or about my family. They weren't privileged. By that point, they were solidly middle class, but they had everything that they had achieved on their own through very hard work and through self-sacrifice. So I thought that whole view of my parents, of the generation to which my parents belonged, was false. Perhaps it was true of some people in that generation, but certainly it wasn't true of the people that I knew. I think that was the primary thing. The other was views about the United States. My parents were quite patriotic. My father had served for 5 years in the Army during World War II, and this was the time of the Vietnam War in the United States, and a lot of people were, certainly a lot of students, probably most of the students were opposed to the war, which I could understand their opposition to the war, but that to me was a political disagreement with the civilian leadership of the country. But to transfer that to a dislike of the antipathy to the United States, and not just to those who had made the particular decisions to go to war in Vietnam, or to blame the soldiers, ordinary soldiers who had gone there. Most of them had been drafted. To scorn them, I thought was very wrong.
considering the difficulties that your father had to find a teaching job, I would say things have changed in America, haven't they?
They had changed. I really did not experience any discrimination, certainly nothing like what my parents experienced. I had one interview for a summer job with a law firm in Philadelphia, and this lawyer said to me, now this is after I graduated from Princeton and I was in Yale Law School, and he said, you know, do you think you would really feel comfortable working at our law firm because it's a blue blood law firm? Well, this is a very odd and antiquated thing to say. So I ended up, I did not take a job there. And then later I became a judge in Philadelphia, a federal judge, Federal Court of Appeals judge in Philadelphia. And lawyers for this law firm were constantly appearing before me, so I thought that was an interesting turnaround.
There was a mention of an Italian factor when you were nominated, right? There was something in the press. Actually, even the NIAF had to mobilize and come in your support. I remember President Ciongoli and others. So how was that?
Yeah, it was a strange thing, and it popped up, and then NIAF was very helpful, and some other people, and it was squashed. So I was opposed for lots of other reasons, but that turned out not to be one of the major factors. I had been, before I became a judge, I was a federal prosecutor in New Jersey, and we handled, among other cases, we had a very big case involving an Italian-American organized crime family and the case did not go well. And so that's what this was about, that somehow my office had not done what it should have done in this case, and people were trying to make something of it. But this connection with the mafia is something that has always haunted Italian Americans. This sort of the suspicion that every Italian American must have some connection with organized crime, and it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to shake. I think it's mostly gone now, but the stereotype is still there, and you see it. You'll see it all the time in advertisements and things of that nature.
Does it bother you?
It does bother me, yes, because it's very unfair, and I do think it influences the way people think about they see someone with an Italian last name, and this thought still does go through their minds. Oh, there must be something.
When Mario Cuomo became governor, reportedly he said, he told his family, we made it finally, meaning we, the Italians. Have you ever thought something like this when you were nominated and then you were chosen?
I do think it's true. I think that a lot of Italian Americans have achieved success in every walk of life in the United States, and I do think that everything is open to people of Italian ancestry now. What concerns me is that Italian Americans and their descendants are going to forget the experiences of the past. Both of my parents are, as I have mentioned, are of Italian ancestry, but my children are half of Italian ancestry, and if I have grandchildren, there's a fair chance they'll be 1/4, and my great-grandchildren will be 1/8, and so Italian Americans tend to be very inclusive, so all these people will be Italian Americans, and they should be thought of that way, but this is a measure of the way in which Italians have been integrated become part of the broader American society. So there are going to be a lot of people in the United States who don't have Italian last names, who have Italian ancestry, and a lot of people with Italian last names who are only a fraction of Italian. And there's nothing bad about that. It's a good thing. But what I'm concerned about is that the cultural history and the experiences, the hard experiences that the Italians who came to the United States went through will be forgotten. It's important for people as individuals because it's their heritage, but it's also an important part, a very important part of the history of the United States, and I think it is relevant to issues that we are grappling with right now, so it should not be forgotten.
I've read that when you were a student, you were joking maybe with your friends, and you dreamed of sitting in the Supreme Court. So now you've been a judge for 10 years. Is there any different than what you dreamed of when you were a student? Anything that you learned that you wouldn't have expected?
Well, I never really expected to get here. When I was in college, I was very interested in the Supreme Court, and I had actually had a little scholarship during the summer to go to Italy. This was the first time I had been, to study the Italian Constitutional Court, and that's what I wrote my senior thesis on. And so when I came back, I was trying to write something humorous for my entry in the yearbook, and I said, I dream of warming a seat on the Supreme Court. I never thought that it would happen. I didn't think it would happen until the moment when I received a phone call saying that the president was going to nominate me. It's a wonderful privilege to be here. It is a great experience. And it's different from what I anticipated, even when I was a judge on the Court of Appeals, so one level below the Supreme Court. Because on the Courts of Appeals, on a lower court, most of the time I was just following what the Supreme Court had done. I would read what the Supreme Court decisions and apply those precedents to the cases that came before me. Here, most of the things that we decide are not governed directly by some prior decision, and so it's a great responsibility.
Sometimes, I think you said once that sometimes you go back home late and it's all empty, and you walk through these corridors. What do you feel?
Well, that's exactly right. On a daily basis, I'm coming to work. This is the place where I work. It's my office. And so I don't think about it. This is what I do, and I've been doing it now for 10 years, and I enjoy it, but I'm familiar with it. But it does hit me sometimes, as I mentioned, late at night. If I stay later and the building is pretty much empty, and I walk through these corridors outside, it will strike me that actually you're a justice on the Supreme Court. How did that ever happen? And it is the responsibility of the position and kind of the incredible good luck that I've had to get here strikes me. If I sit here and I look at we're in a room with portraits of past Chief Justices, so many of them are huge historical figures, and to think that I'm a justice on the same court where Chief Justice Taft sat or Chief Justice Hughes, that's really striking. I'll mention one other thing about the building. It's a marble building, and it was finished in 1935. We have a curator who keeps track of everything about the history of the building, as well as a lot of things about the history of the court. And so she has a wealth of information. I asked her once if she had any information about the men who built this building in the 1930s during the Depression. Because obviously there were a lot of stonemasons who worked on this building, and at that time a pretty high percentage of the stonemasons in the United States were Italians. That's something that a lot of Italians, it was a craft they had in Italy and they brought it here. And she has no record whatsoever about the men who built this building during the Depression. But I do imagine lots of Italian immigrants working to build this magnificent structure.
Justice Green, thanks very much.
It's been
Thanks
my pleasure.
very much for having us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.